The sound of tires grinding against the asphalt and that steady rhythmic thud every time the car crossed a seam in the highway were the only things standing between James and the dead silence swallowing Route 77. It was just past midnight. Jim's eyes were locked on the headlights as they sliced through the desert darkness like a hot blade cutting through heavy black cloth. Karen, his wife, was asleep in the passenger seat, her cheek pressed against the window, her calm breathing leaving a thin fog on the cold glass. Jim didn't mind the silence. Not one bit. He'd always loved driving at night, especially on long hauls like this one. The road empties out, the world goes quiet, and that steady hum gives you room to think, or maybe room to run from thinking. His fingers tapped lightly on the steering wheel, keeping time with the jazz playlist coming through the speakers. A playlist he'd made just for trips like these. They were somewhere unknown now, somewhere past Barstow, deep in a long desert corridor where there was nothing but the road, ancient towering trees that appeared and disappeared in the darkness, and a few faded signs for forgotten towns or food brands whose owners probably died decades ago. Jim had checked the GPS about 10 minutes ago. There was no sign of anything nearby, just a blue line in the middle of a black void that seemed to stretch on forever. No lights except his headlights and the faint glow of the moon hiding behind thin clouds. He was just about to zone out again when his eyes caught something strange on the horizon. A light, an orange glow, warm and steady, rising from behind a sandy hill ahead. It wasn't headlights from another car. It wasn't the dull flicker of government road lamps either. It was a warm, radiant light, brighter than it should be, like sunlight but from a tiny sun that had no business being there. For a moment Jim thought maybe he'd fallen asleep at the wheel and this was all a dream. He rubbed his eyes hard. The light was still there. In fact, it was getting brighter and clearer the closer he got. The road suddenly became smooth. Instead of the rough, cracked asphalt he'd been driving on for hours, a clean sidewalk appeared with fresh black and white lines painted so perfectly they looked like they'd been done that morning. And then came the sign, a wooden sign, old-fashioned, classic in every way, written in beautiful Victorian-style lettering. Welcome to Lantern Falls. Population, Serenity. Jim eased off the gas. His heart started beating with a curiosity that didn't feel comfortable. Lantern Falls. He knew this highway by heart. He'd driven it dozens of times. He'd never heard that name before, not once, and the GPS hadn't mentioned it either. The moment the car crossed into the town limits, everything changed completely. It wasn't a small town in the way you'd expect. It was a small city that looked like it had walked straight out of a black and white movie from the 1940s. Except right now it was painted in colors so vivid they were almost impossible. The houses were 2 stories tall, built in that perfect 1950s style with wooden balconies and red tile roofs. The streets were clean to a suspicious degree. Not a single fallen leaf on the ground. Not a grain of sand anywhere, even though they were in the heart of the desert. The light he'd seen from a distance was coming from brass lanterns hanging everywhere. Old-fashioned lanterns giving off a warm glow that made everything around you look beautiful in a terrifying way. The shops were open despite it being the middle of the night. A barber shop with a red and white pole spinning slowly in the breeze. Hand-painted Coca-Cola ads on the walls. A pharmacy with a glass display case glowing with colorful medicine jars. Karen, wake up. Look where we are. Jim reached over and gently touched his wife's shoulder. Karen opened her eyes slowly, sat up straight, and wiped her face. What is it, Jim? Are we in Kingman already? No, this isn't Kingman. Look outside. Look at this place. Karen looked through the window and her eyes went wide with shock. What is this? Where are we? What is Lantern Falls? I've never seen a place like this in my life. It's so clean, Jim. And the light feels strange. Too comfortable. Jim parked the car in front of an old lounge. Soft music and distant laughter drifted out from inside. But the strangeness wasn't just in the cleanliness or the impossible beauty. It was the feeling. A silence so thick it felt like if you screamed your voice would be swallowed whole. Because nothing that loud was allowed in a place like this. They stepped out of the car. Jim felt his feet touch ground that was impossibly dry. No trace of the sand that surrounded them for miles in every direction. The air smelled like jasmine and sandalwood, an old deep scent that reminded you of your grandmother's house. They saw people walking down the street, men wearing wide-collared shirts and pressed slacks, women in swing dresses with perfectly styled hair. All of them were smiling at each other, and when they noticed Jim and Karen, they gave a quiet, polite nod. But nobody spoke. "Jim, I'm scared." Karen moved closer and grabbed his arm. "These people don't look real. They look like mannequins, like they're painted." Jim laughed, trying to reassure her, but he himself felt something was deeply wrong. Something in his gut was screaming that this place wasn't natural. "It's probably a tourist spot, babe, or some kind of heritage village done up in a vintage style. Hold on, let me ask that guy over there." Jim approached a man standing in front of a newsstand. The man was wearing a vest and smoking a brown cigarette that smelled like aged tobacco. "Excuse me, sir. Good evening. Could you tell me what county Lantern Falls is in? And where's the nearest gas station?" The man looked at him with a wide smile. A smile so fixed it hurt Jim's eyes to look at. "Lantern Falls is Lantern Falls, son. Place for those searching for rest. We're not part of any county, and nobody needs gas as long as they're here with us." His voice was so calm it sounded like it was recorded on an old tape. Jim stepped back. Suddenly the warm light that had charmed him seconds ago started to feel suffocating. The orange hue grew heavier. The shadows on the ground began to stretch in unnatural ways. He looked at his watch. The hands had stopped. He pulled out his phone. No signal. And the date on the screen read May 15th, 1962. "Karen, get in the car. Now." Jim's voice came out tight and wired. Karen didn't argue. The moment he turned the key, the engine roared. It was way too loud for the silence around them. Like the town itself was offended by any foreign sound. He pulled out fast. His eyes were glued to the rearview mirror. The man in the vest was still standing there, smiling, raising his hand in a slow wave goodbye. But his hand wasn't moving like a human hand. It moved like it was underwater, heavy and dreamlike. They crossed the town's border, and suddenly it was like someone had flipped a switch. The orange light vanished. The clean asphalt turned back to cracked and broken road. The desert darkness swallowed everything around them. Jim floored it to 90 miles per hour. He didn't look back for a full 30 minutes. The whole way back, neither of them said a word. Karen was crying silently. Jim was trying to process what had just happened. When they reached Kingman the next morning, Jim pulled into the first gas station he could find. "Hey man, is there a town around here called Lantern Falls?" The attendant looked at him like he was crazy. "Lantern what?" "Listen buddy, I've been working this stretch for 30 years. There's nothing out in that desert but sand and coyotes. You look like you fell asleep at the wheel and the dark played tricks on you." Jim stayed quiet, but as he pulled out cash to pay, something fell from his pocket. A small piece of paper that must have stuck to his clothes while they were in the town. It was a coupon from the barber shop. The paper was yellowed and old. Written on it in beautiful handwriting were the words, "We hope your next visit lasts longer. Lantern Falls never forgets its children." Jim felt a chill that made every hair on his body stand up. The paper was real, but the date printed on it was August 17th, 1939, the day his father was born. For the entire week that followed, Lantern Falls wasn't just a memory. It was a ringing in Jim's ears that wouldn't stop. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the orange light. He smelled the jasmine. He heard the soft laughter drifting from the lounge. Karen was trying to forget. She kept telling herself it was a shared hallucination caused by exhaustion from the long drive. But Jim knew the paper in his pocket was real, and the date on it wasn't just a misprint. It was a message, personal invitation. "Karen, we have to go back. We have to make sure we're not losing our minds." Jim said it while packing a small bag on a Friday night. Karen looked at him with a fear she could barely contain. "Jim, please don't. That place isn't normal. Didn't you see the people's faces? They looked like plastic, like they were waiting for us to make a mistake. That's exactly why we need to go back, to close this door and find out the truth." They got in the car again. This time Jim came prepared. A hand-crank flashlight, a paper map, a professional camera to document everything. They drove the same road, past the same faded signs, the same towering trees swaying in the wind, appearing and vanishing like ghosts. Jim watched the odometer carefully. "We're here, Karen. This is the exact point where the light appeared last time." But this time there was no light. The darkness was thick and heavy, so dense that the headlights seemed to struggle to cut through it. No painted curbs, no jasmine scent. Jim slowed down. Then suddenly the headlights hit something that made both their hearts drop. A wooden sign, but this time it was broken, lying on its side, covered in a thick layer of dust and cobwebs. The letters were mostly gone, but you could still make out fragments. LANT faded ERN, then FAL barely visible LS. "This is it. But it's destroyed," Karen asked, and her voice was shaking. They drove past the sign into the town limits. And here the shock was beyond anything they could measure. Lantern Falls, the city that had been gleaming and spotless just a week ago, had turned into a graveyard. The houses that had been built with red tile roofs and wooden balconies were now collapsed concrete shells. Windows shattered, doors ripped off and thrown into the streets. The warm orange light had been replaced by the pale moonlight, which revealed the full scale of the devastation. No one in the streets, no lounge, no barber shop, just a smell of rot spreading everywhere. Old paper and fine dust that floated with every breeze. Jim parked the car in front of what used to be the Serenity Inn. The building was still there, but half the second-floor ceiling had caved in. Jim got out holding a powerful flashlight. Karen clung to his back like a lost child. "Look, Karen. Look at that sign." He aimed the flashlight at a sign that read Lantern Falls Pharmacy. It was rusted, and the glass display that days ago had been gleaming with colorful jars was now a pile of broken glass and white powder scattered everywhere. How? How does all this happen in 1 week? Jim whispered to himself in disbelief. This would take 100 years to get to this state. He started walking through the streets. With every step, he heard dry wood cracking under his feet. This is where the real terror began seeping into his bones. The idea that time had no meaning in this place. This place wasn't just dead. It was forgotten with a force that went beyond human understanding. They reached the newsstand where they'd seen the man in the vest. There was no shop anymore. Just an old wooden kiosk with a rusted tin roof banging in the wind with a metallic rhythmic sound. Jim crouched down and saw a pile of papers under the dust. He pulled one out and shook it clean. It was a copy of the Los Angeles Times. But the date was November 4th, 1956, and the headline was about the Suez Crisis. "This place has no fixed time, Jim," Karen said, spinning around in place. "We're in a completely different zone. A place where time is broken like the glass we're stepping on." Then suddenly they heard a sound, a steady tapping, coming from inside the collapsed Serenity Inn. A quiet knock, like someone drumming their fingernails on a wooden surface. Jim steeled himself and aimed the flashlight toward a broken window on the ground floor. In the darkness, something glinted, something moved, a shadow darker and heavier than the darkness around it, moving with an impossible slowness like thick smoke being played in slow motion. The shadow stopped, and Jim felt eyes that didn't exist staring at him, staring into his soul. In that moment, the air around them turned so cold it ached in their bones, and the silence that had filled the town last time transformed into a soundless scream filling their ears. "We need to leave, right now." Jim grabbed Karen and ran toward the car. As he got in, he caught something in the side mirror that froze him solid. In the middle of all that ruin, for just 1 second, like a camera flash, he saw the man in the vest standing in front of the kiosk. But the kiosk wasn't destroyed anymore. In that flash, it was lit up and whole. The man was wearing his sharp clothes, smoking his brown cigarette and raising his hand in greeting. And next to him stood a woman. Her face was blurred, but she was wearing Karen's exact dress. The one Karen was wearing right now. Jim slammed the gas. The car screamed as it spun in the sand. The whole way back, he didn't look in the mirror. He was terrified he'd see himself standing there in the ruins waving goodbye to himself. When they got home, Jim couldn't sleep. He went into his father's study. Colonel Wesley had passed away years ago. Jim started digging through old boxes he'd always been afraid to open. In the bottom of a cardboard box labeled Unclassified Files 1968, he found a sealed envelope closed with a wax stamp. He opened it with trembling hands and found old Polaroid photos. First photo, the Lantern Falls sign, brand new and gleaming. Second photo, his father as a young man standing in front of the jazz lounge with a man wearing a vest holding a brown cigarette. And beside them a young woman who looked like Karen to a terrifying degree. Written on the back of the photo in his father's handwriting. "We went back after 3 days. Found nothing but sand. Lantern Falls is not a place. It's a condition. And whoever enters it, a part of them stays there forever." Jim let the photo fall from his hand. Then suddenly he heard the sound again. Coming from the study window, the steady tapping. The tapping on the glass wasn't just a passing noise. It was a bony finger knocking with a maddening regularity against Jim's nerves. He stood up suddenly. The chair spun behind him violently. He rushed to the window and yanked the curtain open. Nothing outside but the quiet darkness of the Pasadena streets and a streetlight flickering with a dying glow. No one there. No tree close enough to touch the glass. But the feeling of being watched was still there. Like the air itself had eyes. Jim sat back down at his father's desk. Colonel Wesley had always been a mystery to him. He wasn't just an officer. He was a silent man who spent hours in his study. And there was always a forbidden zone in his conversations about his work in the 60s and 70s. Jim picked up the Polaroid again. His hand trembled as he held it under the bright desk lamp. The man in the vest, that smile, the way his arm was thrown casually over his father's shoulder. Uncle Sully. But Uncle Sully had died in a mysterious accident in 1969. Everyone said he got lost in the desert. They never found his body. And the woman next to him. Jim squinted painfully. She was a carbon copy of Karen. Same posture. Same hairstyle that was fashionable back then. Even the same small mole near her lips. Jim opened the notebook that was under the photos. It was a leather-bound journal with a black cover. The pages inside were yellow and smelled like mothballs. He began reading his father's slanted, broken handwriting. Classified memo. August 1968. Lantern Falls is not a town. It is a rift. We made a grave error when we thought we could map it on military charts. Lantern Falls chooses who enters, and it chooses what they see. Sullivan insists on going back. He says he left a part of himself there. I can see him fading before my eyes. His body is here, but his eyes are looking at another place. A place painted in orange. A place that smells of jasmine. A place where time has stopped. Jim felt a cold crawl up his spine. He started flipping pages faster. He found strange reports, geographic coordinates that kept changing, notes about a classified task force that had been studying the phenomena since the early 60s. February 1969. Sullivan has disappeared. The sign that was there yesterday has vanished today. I went with a full unit. We found nothing but sand and scorpions. The ground there rejects existence. But I hear him now. I hear his tapping on my office window. Every night, he's trying to come back. Or perhaps he's trying to pull me in. I must warn my son. I will leave him these papers. Perhaps fate will not lead him down that cursed desert highway. Jim, what are you doing in here in the dark? Karen's voice made him jump. She was standing in the doorway wearing her bathrobe, her face pale as if she hadn't seen him in years. Nothing, sweetheart, just some old papers of Dad's. Looking through them. Jim tried to hide the journal, but Karen walked in and came closer to the desk. Did you hear the sound? She asked, staring at the window with terror. What sound? The knocking. Someone was knocking on the bedroom window. A steady knock, like someone was counting down the seconds of my life. Jim held her close. Her body was trembling like a small bird. In that moment, Jim realized that Lantern Falls wasn't just a town they'd seen on the highway. It was an infection that had spread to them. The place doesn't let go of anyone who's seen it. Keeps haunting them until it pulls them back. Let's get some sleep, Karen. Tomorrow morning everything will be better. But tomorrow morning was worse. When Jim woke up, he found Karen sitting in the living room. The TV was on, tuned to a classic channel playing shows from the 1960s. She wasn't responding to him. She was staring at the screen with an eerie focus. Karen, good morning. No answer. He moved closer. Her eyes had an orange tint in them, a faint glow, as if they were reflecting a light that didn't exist in the room. The living room smelled like jasmine, a strong choking scent that hadn't been there a minute ago. Jim ran to the kitchen to get water. He opened a drawer to grab a spoon and found the barbershop coupon from Lantern Falls sitting inside the drawer, even though he'd kept it in his wallet. And next to it, he found a new Polaroid photo. A photo of him and Karen sitting in their living room right now. But the photo was faded and its frame was aged and old. Written on the back were the words, "Preparing for final return." The horror here for Jim wasn't about monsters with long teeth. It was about reality tearing apart around him. Jim felt like the apartment he lived in had been cut out from another place. The walls had started to stretch. The The sounds from the street outside had begun to fade and turn into static like an old radio losing its signal. He rushed back into the study in a frenzy, started searching through the maps his father had left behind. He found a hand-drawn map with a large red dot in the heart of the desert. Next to it was written, "Point of dissolution, Lantern Falls. Entry requires a sacrifice of memory." Jim understood that his father had been trying to protect him, but the reckless curiosity in his blood was what had dragged him there. This place was a living creature. It fed on people's memories, trapped them in a time bubble forever. Uncle Sully didn't die. Uncle Sully became one of the smiling residents of that eternal town. "Jim, come look at this." Karen's voice came from the living room, but this time it sounded metallic, distant. He ran out. Karen was standing in front of the large mirror in the hall, but she wasn't looking at her reflection. She was looking at the town. In the mirror's reflection, the living room was gone. In its place was a street from Lantern Falls. People walking. The man in the vest standing in the middle of the road, beckoning to her. "Come. The place is calling us, Jim. It says we're late for our appointment." Karen turned her face toward Jim, and for the first time he saw that her features had started to fade. The whites of her eyes had grown larger. Her smile had become fixed and wide in a terrifying way. The exact same smile as the town's residents. "We're not going back, Karen. I won't let them take you." Jim screamed and smashed the mirror with a dining chair. The mirror shattered into 100 pieces, but each broken shard on the floor still reflected images of Lantern Falls. Every piece of glass was like a tiny window into a street or a house over there. In that moment, the house phone rang. Jim picked up the receiver with a trembling hand. "Hello?" No answer, but there was music. Soft jazz coming from far away. The same playlist he'd had playing in the car the night they first found the town. Then the sound of someone breathing slowly, and Uncle Sully's voice saying just one sentence. "Jim, you forgot your keys here. Come pick them up." Jim slammed the phone down. He looked around. The apartment walls had started turning orange. The wallpaper was peeling off, revealing old red brick behind it. Abandoned ancient brick. The same kind he'd seen when he visited Lantern Falls the second time, when it had turned to ruins. "Karen, pack your things. We're leaving. We're getting out of the country." Jim grabbed Karen's hand, but it was cold as ice, and the texture wasn't human skin. It was smooth plastic. He looked at her hand. Her fingers had started fusing together. Terror reached its peak for Jim. He wasn't just losing a place. He was losing the woman he loved. She was transforming right before his eyes, slowly becoming a mannequin, one of the permanent residents of Lantern Falls. "We need to go back, Jim." Karen said the words, and suddenly every light in the apartment went out. In the darkness, Jim heard the knocking again, but this time it wasn't on the window. The knocking was coming from inside his own chest. He turned on his phone's flashlight. He found himself standing in the middle of the living room, but there was no furniture, no carpets, nothing but heavy dust and a choking smell of jasmine, and an old broken sign leaning against the wall. "The Serenity Inn. We wish you an eternal stay." He hadn't gotten out of the town. He was still there. Everything that had happened since was a dream he couldn't escape. The flashlight in his hand was shaking. The beam bounced off walls whose features were changing before his eyes. The apartment he'd poured his heart into furnishing in Pasadena was now just a concrete skeleton that smelled of damp and decay. Everything had vanished. Rugs, paintings, furniture, all gone. Karen? Where are you? Jim's voice came out muffled. The air had grown thicker. The place was absorbing sound and trapping it. He started moving through the apartment that was no longer an apartment. Every room he entered opened onto a completely different part of Lantern Falls. He walked into the kitchen and found himself in a long dark corridor. At the end was a wooden door with a sign that read Victory Theater. He pushed the door open and entered the auditorium. It was completely empty. The red velvet seats were torn open with stuffing spilling out like the guts of a dead animal. But on the big screen a film was playing. It wasn't a movie. It was moving Polaroid footage of Jim and Karen in the car the night they first arrived. Jim watched himself on screen laughing. He watched Karen sleeping peacefully. Then the image froze on Jim's face. He was staring directly at the camera with a smile that was too wide, teeth too white, disturbingly perfect. The Jim on screen raised his hand and pointed at the Jim in the auditorium. His lips moved, forming one word that couldn't be heard, but was felt deep inside Jim's skull. No, this isn't real. This is a time rift. This is a hallucination. Jim screamed and ran out of the theater. He found himself on the street with the lounge, the one he'd seen the first time. But now the town was neither beautiful nor ruined. It was both at once. Half of each building was lit and pristine. The other half was collapsed and blackened. The people walking the streets were half human. The man in the vest. His right side was sharp and dapper, smoking his cigarette. His left side was a skeleton draped in rotting cloth. Jim ran toward the lounge. He could hear his jazz music, but this time it was distorted. Slow, like it was playing from underwater. He entered the lounge and saw the stage. There, among the band, he found himself. Another copy, wearing a patterned shirt from the 70s. Sitting behind a drum kit, playing with steady precision. Jim, the drummer version of him, looked at the real Jim with terrifying coldness. What took you so long? The whole band's been waiting. Where's Karen? Jim asked, his whole body shaking. The drummer nodded toward a dark corner of the lounge. There was Karen, sitting at a table. But it wasn't the Karen he knew. It was a plastic mannequin wearing her exact dress. A wig matching her hair color glued perfectly to the plastic head. The mannequin was holding a glass in its hand. A glass of water. But it wasn't moving. Its plastic fingers were frozen in midair. What did you do to her? Jim lunged at his other self on the stage. But the moment he touched it, his hand passed through empty space. The copy dissolved into orange smoke with no texture. We didn't do anything, Jim. The drummer's voice came from everywhere in the room at once. You're the one who chose this. This place doesn't trap memories. It records them. Karen is already a memory. And for her to stay, you have to become one too. Jim felt pain in his limbs. He looked at his hands. His skin was fading, turning pale like dry autumn leaves. His fingertips felt rough and matte. The horror took full hold. He wasn't dying. He was turning into an object, a relic in a dead city. Then suddenly he heard a muffled scream. Karen's real voice, coming from the basement of the lounge. Jim gathered every ounce of strength and fought against the heaviness overtaking his body. He ran toward the basement stairs. Down below it was pitch dark. Nothing but his weakening flashlight. He found a room full of mannequins. Hundreds of plastic bodies stacked on top of each other. Men, women, children. All with blank faces. All dressed in clothing from different eras. In the middle of them he found Karen, tied to an old wooden chair. A black cloth covering her eyes. Karen, I'm here. He untied her quickly. Karen collapsed into his arms sobbing. "Jim, this place is eating me. I can feel myself disappearing. I'm forgetting my own name. You won't forget anything. We're getting out of here. Right now." Jim pulled her up and they ran for the stairs. But the lounge was changing. The walls were closing in. The stairs were leading to dead ends. The place was rearranging itself to keep them from leaving. Jim stopped in his tracks, looked up at the ceiling and screamed, "Let us out. We don't belong here." The answer came as a collective laugh from every mannequin in the building. A dry, soulless laugh. Then the man in the vest appeared. But this time he wasn't waving goodbye. He was blocking the door. "Your father tried to run, Jim, and he spent the rest of his life hearing us knock on his window. You're smarter than him. Accept the truth. There is no desert highway out there. There is no out there. Just sand and illusion." Jim looked at Karen. Her face was starting to fade again. In a moment of desperation, he remembered the journal. The sentence at the end. "Exit requires a sacrifice of memory." Jim understood. The place demanded a price. He pulled out his wallet, took out the barbershop coupon, the Polaroid photos from his father's study, and his house keys. "Take all of this. Take my entire past. Take every memory I have of my father. Take everything that connects me to the world outside. But leave me, Karen, and let us walk out of here." He threw everything down in front of them. The objects burst into a cold blue flame. The fire consumed the photos and the keys. And with them, Jim felt a massive void opening in his mind. He forgot what their home looked like. He forgot his father's name completely. He forgot the smell of their apartment. He forgot everything, except Karen's face. In that moment, a crack appeared in the wall of the lounge. Behind it blazed a white light, not orange, the light of real daylight. He grabbed Karen's hand, and without a single word they ran with everything they had toward the light. They felt themselves passing through a thick, heavy membrane, and suddenly they were lying on sand. The air was hot, smelled like dust and sun. Jim stood up coughing. He looked around. They were on the shoulder of the desert highway. The car was parked a few yards away, covered in a thick layer of sand and dust, as if it had been sitting there for a month. No lantern falls, no lounge, no jasmine scent, just an endless desert stretching to the horizon and a burning sun telling them it was the middle of the day. Karen was sitting next to him, staring into nothing. "Jim." "Yes, sweetheart. Where were we? And who am I?" Jim stared at her in horror. The price had been too high. Karen had forgotten herself. The desert highway wasn't just asphalt. It was a thin thread trying to stitch Jim and Karen's wounds back to the real world. But the wound was too deep. Jim pulled Karen gently and got her into the car. His hand was still trembling as he searched for the key. The engine started with difficulty, making a sound like a muffled scream in the middle of the desert. He checked the rearview mirror. No trace of the orange light, not even the broken sign. Nothing but sand slowly crawling over their tire tracks, erasing the truth. The whole drive back to Los Angeles, Karen sat in total silence, her eyes fixed on the emptiness outside the window. The texture of her hand was still wrong, too dry, a texture that had nothing to do with human skin. Jim kept trying to talk, to start any conversation, to call her name. But every time he said her name, he felt a lump in his throat, like he was pronouncing a word that had become foreign to him. He himself was starting to feel black holes in his memory. He tried to picture their apartment in Pasadena, the color of the walls, anything, nothing, He remembered that he had a father, a military colonel, but he couldn't remember his face when he smiled. The sacrifice of memory had begun eating away at his being like termites. When they reached Pasadena the next morning, the sun was rising coldly above the trees. Jim parked the car and they went up to the apartment. The moment he walked in, he felt a tightness in his chest. The apartment was the same, furniture in place, photos on the walls, but there was a faint scent of jasmine, a scent that had never existed in their home before. "Karen, go lie down. I'll make us something to drink," Jim said, trying to appear normal. Karen turned and looked at him, and the smile on her face was what truly terrified him. It wasn't a tired smile. It was a fixed expression, painted on. "Sure, Jim. Lantern Falls is very relaxing, isn't it?" Jim froze. "We're in Los Angeles, Karen. We came back." She didn't nod, didn't speak, just walked into the bedroom with an exaggerated slowness, like she was moving through heavy water. Jim ran to the study. He'd forgotten what he was even looking for, but his instincts led him to the locked drawer. He'd forgotten that the key had been destroyed in the fire at Lantern Falls, but he found the drawer slightly open. Inside was a shock that dismantled his thoughts. The Polaroid photos he'd sacrificed were there, but they'd changed. The photo that had shown his father with Uncle Sully now had three people: his father, Uncle Sully, and Jim himself. Jim was standing in the photo wearing the exact same shirt he was wearing right now, with the exact same look of terror in his eyes, in the middle of Lantern Falls. In 1969. 1969? I wasn't even born yet. Jim screamed and threw the photos on the floor. He grabbed his father's black journal again, but this time the writing was changing before his eyes. The black ink was bleeding across the pages and reshaping itself. October 2026. My son James has arrived. The circle is complete. Lantern Falls doesn't take bodies, takes roles. Sullivan was the photographer. I was the observer. And now James is the drummer. Karen will not return as Karen. Karen will become the guardian, the one who watches the entrance. Forever. Jim felt a ringing in his ears, the sound of drums in the distance, steady and calling. He stood up and ran to the bedroom. "Karen, this apartment isn't our home. We're still inside the rift." He threw open the bedroom door and stood there stunned. The bed was empty. There was nothing there but a plastic mannequin wearing Karen's bathrobe, her real hair attached to the plastic head with horrifying precision. The mannequin was lying in a comfortable position, its glass eyes staring at the ceiling with cold indifference. "Karen," Jim whispered in a broken voice. The answer didn't come from the bedroom, came from the mirror behind him. He looked in the mirror and saw another Jim standing behind him, a copy with smooth plastic features, wearing a patterned shirt, holding two drumsticks in his hand. "You forgot the most important thing, Jim." The copy spoke in a voice Jim knew well, his own voice. "Lantern Falls isn't a town you run from. Lantern Falls is you. You built its streets from your memories. You filled it with the people you love so they'd never leave you. Ever." Jim's vision began to blur. The walls started to melt. He felt himself drowning in an ocean of orange light. He tried to grab onto anything real. He gripped the door handle, but the handle dissolved in his hand. Jim understood the full truth in that final moment. His father hadn't been trying to escape. His father had passed the torch. The task force hadn't been studying the place. The task force had been feeding it, making sure it didn't grow beyond control. Everyone who entered was just a sacrifice, so the place wouldn't consume all of reality. Lantern Falls was a black hole that swallowed the souls of families who passed by and trapped them in an eternal performance of peace. Jim surrendered. The pain in his limbs disappeared. In its place came a feeling of weightlessness. He looked at his hands. They had turned white and gleaming, as if they were made of the finest porcelain. He looked at Karen. She had risen from the bed, and she smiled at him. A real smile. The smile he had always loved. "Come on, Jim. The show's about to start. Everyone's waiting for their drummer." The desert highway. 2 a.m. A brand new car cruising at high speed. Inside, a young man and his fiancée. Laughing. Music blasting. Suddenly the young man slowed down and stared at the horizon. Jim surrendered. The pain in his limbs disappeared. In its place came a feeling of weightlessness. He looked at his hands. They had turned white and gleaming, as if they were made of the finest porcelain. He looked at Karen. She had risen from the bed, and she smiled at him. A real smile. The smile he had always loved. "Come on, Jim. The show's about to start. Everyone's waiting for their drummer." The desert highway. 2 a.m. A brand new car cruising at high speed. Inside, a young man and his fiancée. Laughing. Music blasting. Suddenly the young man slowed down and stared at the horizon. "Look, Sarah. What's that orange light out there?" "What is that?" "It looks like a town. The GPS isn't showing anything here." The young man turned onto the side road. Clean black and white lines gleaming in the dark. A sign appeared, written in beautiful Victorian lettering. "Welcome to Lantern Falls. Population, Serenity." Looks like some kind of fancy resort or something. Hold on. I can hear music. Drums coming from that lounge over there. They parked in front of the lounge and stepped out. A man was standing in front of the newsstand, wearing a vest, smoking a brown cigarette. He looked at them and smiled a wide, perfect smile. "Welcome to Lantern Falls. We wish you an eternal and restful stay." And inside the lounge there was a drummer, incredibly talented. He looked just like someone who'd been missing for years. He played with power and precision and passion. And beside him stood a beautiful woman handing out glasses that smelled of jasmine. And on the window of a car parked in the darkness far from the orange glow, a bony finger with no owner tapped steadily on the glass.